In my presentation this morning, I have three parts. The first is that I want to take my title apart a little bit and to reflect on what the challenges are that I'm talking about. Second, I want to explore some of the conundrums that involve religion, ethics, and social justice. And third, I thought you might welcome a little voyage into some practical dimensions of what it all means and what this all might mean for what we do. So let me start with the title, which is Religious and Ethical Challenges in Seeking Global Social Justice. So let's try to unpack that a bit. The notion of global social justice has been touched on in several of the earlier presentations, and especially Father Hare. It's clearly a very large concept. It is if not the central issue that drives the international development profession. And it is also a very central plank in virtually all, if not all, religious traditions. And to my mind, it is that link that is the most central tie that brings this topic into this conference. The question is, what kind of world is it that we're working for? I must say that I realized here that the answer to that is fairly obvious, which is Camden, Maine. But I do find that when I speak to my students and ask them, what is your ideal world? What kind of a society is it that you seek? They find it very difficult to answer that. Well, is it Scandinavia? Is it Switzerland? Is it the United States? And obviously the answer is some kind of a blend of all of these. But the questions are very fundamental to what it is that you're trying to do when you work on development. And when you're talking about social change, sometimes even social engineering, that involves very different communities and very different societies, the question of what it is you're actually trying to do and what is just and what is fair is very fundamental. The development profession, therefore, is a very value-laden, value-rich profession. And one of the ironies of it is that many in the development profession have been rather blind to these topics. They often are uncomfortable, and there has been a tendency of worthy technicians to turn concepts into very technocratic and often very boring language. There is one area where you do see many of the ethical arguments coming into play, which is when funding is involved. And there you have a whole layer of different arguments that go from the moral, what should we do, tugging at heartstrings, compassion, self-interest, fear. Could we have the slide? I have two slides that I thought would give at least some illustration. The first is a New York Times editorial that was published around the time of the first anniversary or the first benchmark meeting on the Millennium Development Goals. But it is basically that last line, 20,000 people perished of extreme poverty. But that this is something that's never in the newspapers, but this is clearly touching at the core moral values of what are we going to do about this. Could I see the next one? I found another one in the Sydney Sunday Morning Herald, which is very much the same headline. But the message is that this is very rare that you see this on the newspaper. So one of the ethical dilemmas is how do you keep these global poverty issues alive in a meaningful way? Now, religious traditions bring great depth and richness to these discussions about values and the implications of different faces of issues. But my colleagues in the development professions often do look at religion and sort of link it to sermons. Well, now, if we could just get the pastors to preach about HIV/AIDS or hand washing, that would be the answer. But another side of religion clearly is the mobilization, the social capital, the degree to which they are involved in education, health, et cetera, which is something that I will come back to. But I think that the central issue for me, and I have to even try to put it in the accent of my favorite archbishop, who's Archbishop Dermot Martin, who's from Dublin. I've heard him time and time again say it's about the dignity of the human person. There is a real sense in which that sense of what it is we're trying to do, how we're linked as a human family, that is very fundamental. That said, I wanted to touch on 5 very dynamic changes that have taken place over my professional career, which is longer than I usually like to admit. But in all of them, you can see the links between religion and development, and it gives you a sense of why this is such a dynamic, why it is such, in fact, also a very controversial area. I think the first is a realization among almost everyone who has worked in development, and I know there are many of you here, that development is not linear and it is not simple. It is not about a magic bullet, is another term or word that is used very often. And this is an area in discussions with religious communities. They remind us time and time again that people are not about sectors. They're not about water. They are about a combination that comes together both in the individual and in the social. And I think that this is something that you've seen the development profession coming to increasingly, that it is not a straight path. There is a danger, I think, in some of the religious reflections and in some of the debates, to a tendency to romanticize the past. I have to say that a past where the vast majority of human beings spent most of their lives being hungry, where a quarter of children routinely died, as they still do today, before they're 5, and where there was very little hope and opportunity for change or for developing potential, is not the society that we want to see. But the effort to try to navigate between the strengths of traditions and the benefits of modernity is something that continues as perhaps even an increasing challenge today. The pace of change, though, is a problem, I think, for everyone. I was at a conference recently in Silicon Valley, and the message there was very clear that we've seen only the beginning of the pace of change that we're going to be seeing in the future. And it is one that is very disorienting to all people, I think to everyone, but particularly to people who are removed from the centers. One of the things that stands out for me, because I have a 17-year-old son, is the comment that most of the jobs that today's 16-year-olds will do have not been invented yet. That we are on a roller coaster ride that is a continuing one for all of us. So I think the complexity, the pace of change is one of the major things that they didn't teach me about in graduate school and that I think is a reality today. A second is that the development community particularly has lived through and is still living through a variety of paradigm changes. The most obvious, when I started on this, there was the first world, the second world, and the third world. For most students today, they don't even know what the second world is or was. We talk about North and South. That's also not a terribly useful concept anymore. We talk about West Islam. I've been doing a lot of work on West Islam. That's a complicated one as well. So there are a whole host of different ways of dividing the world. I think there are 2 comments, though, or 2 things that I have seen and read recently that are very useful. I commend to anyone who hasn't read it Paul Collier's The Bottom Billion. What he has done is he said we need to look at the world differently, that basically you have about 1 billion people that live in a prosperous world. You have 4 or 5 billion that live in the Brazils, Mexicos, Thailands, South Africa, which are basically on the move. And then you have about 1 billion who are stuck, about half of them in situations where conflict is a daily part of life, but that this ladder moving up is harder to get onto today than ever. A second person who I think has a wonderful image is a Swedish health specialist called Hans Rosling, who does these remarkable presentations at the TED conference. But as he was saying, he says he has a neighbor who's an expert on wine, and this neighbor knows 200 different kinds of wine. He knows the grape, the vineyard, and so forth. Rosling says he knows 2 kinds of wine, red and white. But his neighbor, he says, knows 2 kinds of countries, developed and developing. And he, Rosling, knows 200 kinds of countries. That there is just a tremendous variety. So it comes back, in a sense, to this issue of complexity. The third issue that's become, I think, much more vivid in the last years is that poverty, global poverty, women dying in childbirth, children dying of malaria, people dying of HIV/AIDS, people going hungry, whether it's in the United States or in Africa, is a scandal. And it is a scandal because we can do something about it. We have the resources, we have the know-how. Through most of history, and in some senses, many religious traditions are finding this a difficult transition, and it's a very recent one, live in the notion that through most of history, poverty was inevitable. Poverty was something that the poor shall always be with us. But it is not necessary today. Poverty can be defeated. I know certainly, just as 2 examples that I remember from reports that I worked on in my professional life, that both Singapore and Ireland were described and viewed as basically basket cases and hopeless. And today, both of them are very dynamic societies. So this notion that there is something that can be done, there's been huge progress, is a huge mental and moral shift in today's world. Because of that, the fourth change that I've seen is that there is the start, at least, of a shift from discussions about poverty to equity. And I'm going to come back to that point a little bit. My own take is that poverty is morally very simple. The kind of headlines that we saw, children dying of malaria, hungry, it doesn't take very much moral courage to say that is wrong and that if we can do something about it, we should. But it is very difficult. Eradicating poverty, if it were that easy, it would have been fixed because so clearly we have the resources to do it. The issues of equity are much more complex. And I think we've barely begun in the development profession to come to terms with what that really means. What is an equitable society? So on the poverty, we all know that having quality education for all children is perhaps the #1 priority. But it is very difficult. I know, for example, I have a 17-year-old boy, and getting him educated is a full-time job. It's a major challenge. If you think of all the billions of children in the world and the quality of education, our aspirations, translating that into the slogan, education for all, or fast track initiative, the terms that are used for these global programs, is in fact far more difficult than it seems. The final major change that I see and that we're all exploring still is the linking of security and development. I know in the past, the security types, and again, there are many of you here who've worked in the security area, had virtually nothing to do with the development profession. They were completely apart. I know I used to go to some meetings and I could see the glazed eyes when issues of poverty or development came up. There are now a whole set of discussions and explorations that involve how poverty, fundamentalism, extremism, violence, and terrorism are linked. Now, I remember one lesson in an early statistics class, which was that there is a strong correlation between the price of rum and the salaries of Presbyterian ministers. They rise and fall in roughly the same rhythm. Now, clearly, they are not linked to one another. They're linked to something else. And in the same way, poverty and terrorism are not linked to each other directly. Poor people are not terrorists, and terrorists are not poor for the most part. But there are very important ways in which they're linked. And I want to mention two of them. The first one is that weak states and badly governed states, which we heard about yesterday, are a recipe for all kinds of problems. First of all, they're very often caught in poverty. No jobs, schools don't work, health centers don't work. Very, very elementary links that you can make between states which fail and the kind of lack of hope and opportunity. So that, I think, is a first major thread. Laws are difficult to enforce, and it's a vicious circle, which is what Collier is writing about. The second is the sense of injustice that is a very powerful thread. We see this in many polls that focus on how people will basically say this system is not fair. I heard last weekend a remarkable Muslim televangelist, a former accountant, Amr Khalid, who was speaking at a meeting, who emphasized time and time the importance of hope and jobs. He was echoing very much some of the themes in the campaign here: change, hope. But what he was saying, quoting young people across the Muslim world, is, I want a job, I need a hope, I need to be able to dream. Don't make me be an extremist. Don't make me turn to extremism. So this link between fairness, hope, justice, I think, is a very strong one, and it's a transnational challenge, again going back to Father Hare, that in the French Revolution, the peasants could see how the nobles were living, and clearly that made them angry. But they didn't have anything like the images and the in-your-face notion of how the rich live in today's world. One of the abiding images that I have, I worked quite a bit in Morocco, is looking at these hideous tenement blocks where the poor people live in the big cities. Where one of the major things you see is the satellite dishes on the roof. And they are, I'm told, it's mounting all the time, but 200 to 300 different channels. It's very easy for them to bootleg in. So they can see anything. They see the worst images of our cultures. So this sense, and what comes out of it, because they have no chance of a job, no chance of getting married, no chance of interacting with girls in their society, what it is a recipe for frustration at best, and at its worst, it's a recipe for anger. So this notion that what we need to do is to find ways to provide the basis, provide education and health, and to provide the sense of hope that comes with jobs and an opportunity for change, that this is really the fundamental issue that we are all looking at. I'm going to turn now, though the time is clicking on, to some of the religious and ethical challenges. And here I want to stress that in the worlds of religion and the worlds of development, it is very striking how often common purposes and common values become caught in a dialogue of the deaf, as the French would say. And here I wanted to read a small part of a New England poet who is reflecting on something that is in every religious tradition, that I have found, which is the story of the blind man and the elephant. The basic notion that everyone sees the world from a different perspective and becomes very convinced of what they see. So this is Sachs, John Godfrey Sachs. And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. So oft in theologic wars, the disputants, I ween, rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant that none of them has seen. So I think the key theme that I have emerged from in trying to work on these boundaries between religion and development is the centrality of dialogue. That dialogue is not only about talk, but it is about openness to transformation. It is about this sense of curiosity that is so much exemplified here. And I suspect that Doug Johnston will mention, as I've heard him before, that he finds in dealing with people from very different religious traditions that they are comfortable in dealing with people who have a faith tradition and a faith background. Which I think highlights what I have found the greater difficulty of crossing the boundaries between people who have a secular view and those who have a religious view, and therefore the importance of dialogue. So I'm going to touch very quickly on 5 areas that I think are ones where there is a need for a great deal of dialogue because they are central, ethical and practical challenges as we go forward. The first one is this question, returning to this question of poverty and equity. Equity is a very complex word. I've been asked sometimes in presentations that I've done not to use it because nobody really knows what it means. And I have spent some time tracing its origins. And I find it fascinating that a word that means, that comes from the Latin, which is on fairness and justice, has led by a different path to the equities markets and to financial. And there is an interesting link that equity was the sort of residual courts. I'm sure there's some lawyers here who are familiar with this. It was the common sense elements of law, and therefore it came to focus quite a bit on property and the meaning of property and property rights. But the point that I want to make here is that equity is a concept that's used to try to get away from the notion of equality. Because I think we're all uncomfortable with equality. We don't want everything to be the same. That includes even between men and women. So the term equity is an effort to open the door to concepts of balance and of equal standards, but to move away from this concept of sameness. But there are some real dilemmas in the discussion. One of them that I am most aware of is the discomfort, which you see particularly in many religious traditions, with both individual freedom contrasted with the rights of the community, but also with this notion that is so much fundamental to the current economic system that we have of competition. I think it's no accident that the metaphors that we use so often in the development world are sports metaphors. The level playing field. Let's pass the ball. Let's have an. It is a recognition or an acceptance that excellence is linked to competition. But it's interesting that that's also true in the arts, in virtually all areas of endeavor. And yet, there is an awareness that a fair society will not be able to be built, could I have the slide, on just having the level playing field. in some senses, this is an old Oliphant cartoon that I found, and everything goes around. It touches on the question of obesity, but it is an image of how people in the rest of the world see the United States, that there is a lack of balance in the world. So I think that's one. Could I see the second slide? So this question of common threads and standards, but how to have diversity. This, again, is a cartoon which seems to me to exemplify how people in the rest of the world see the invasion of Western culture. And you've got it all. You've got money, you've got McDonald's, you've got Shell, and you've got television, Coca-Cola, and so forth. So these are, I think, some of the images that we have. A third area that I think is a real dilemma, and I'm going to go very quickly, is the tension between charity and rights. Charity is the traditional basis on which a lot of philanthropy has been built, and it is very strongly anchored in religious traditions. The new way of looking at development assistance is in terms of rights, but it's a very difficult concept to translate into practice. But it is the notion that the aid flows that go to developing countries are not purely because people in the rich countries are altruistic and are willing to share and are willing to give back, are willing to contribute, but that when you get to this concept of rights, it is that it is basically an element of justice, that there be a rebalancing of the world. The fourth and the fifth conundrum and areas of activity that I want to highlight, one of the most encouraging things that is happening in the development world is new kinds of partnerships. And these are true across very untraditional boundaries. For example, some of the alliances that are forming around trafficking of women, to combat trafficking of women, the alliances around HIV/AIDS, and the final one, which I think will have tremendous importance as we go forward, which is the concern with care of the earth and the effort to deal with global warming. I'm going to read another quotation and then list very quickly the debates or things that are in my in tray. There's a wonderful scholar who died a couple of years ago, Denis Goulet, who wrote an article a long time ago in 1980, which has one of those titles that sticks, which was One-Eyed Giants. And his image of one-eyed giants is basically of how the development profession, in its somewhat clumsy and not all-seeing way, can distort, even with the best of intentions. And this is the quotation from the Goulet article, which goes back to someone else. The white man, says Lawrence van der Post, came into Africa and Asia and America, for that matter, like a one-eyed giant, bringing with him the characteristic split and blindness, which were at once his strength, his torment, and his ruin. The one-eyed giant had science without wisdom, and he broke in upon ancient civilizations, which, like the medieval West, had wisdom without science, wisdom which transcends and unites, wisdom which dwells in body and soul together, and which, more by means of myth or rite of contemplation than by scientific experiment, opens the door to a life in which the individual is not lost in the cosmos and in society, but found in them. Wisdom which made all life sacred and meaningful, even that which later ages came to call secular and profane. Well, my time is out, so what I'm going to do is just to read you a list of 10 things that are in my in tray, that are here as examples of how this translates, how all this general translates into practice, and then leave for the question and answer a follow-up on how these issues might be followed up by people here or elsewhere. I have 10 things. I have at least 50 in my in tray, but these are 10. There's a proposal from a set of Catholic bishops who want to organize a meeting to discuss extractive industries policies. Extractive industries is gold, oil, etc. Secondly, a young woman is asking for my advice because she wants to get donations from companies who make sanitary napkins so that they can be given to poor women who have nothing through religious organizations. Third, the World Council of Churches is asking us to organize a meeting on the rice trade with the idea that the right to food contradicts the kinds of trade reforms and liberalization that's happening. Fourth, someone wants to find ways to support a march against female feticide in India. Sixth, a Dutch rabbi is interested in taking next steps on the Earth Charter, which is a manifesto that has strong religious roots on care of the earth. Seventh, there's a proposal to try to build mechanisms that will increase the flow of funds to faith-run programs which are working on HIV/AIDS, orphans, care of the sick, and treatment. There is a large meeting at the Washington National Cathedral in April, which is on women, religion, and development. And the discussion that's underway is how to frame those issues in a practical way that could make a difference. There is a biannual International Anti-Corruption Conference, which is going to take place in October in Athens, Greece. And they are asking for advice on how to bring in religious voices into the discussion of international anti-corruption practices. And I think I don't know how many I have now, but anyway, the last one that I will mention is that there is an alliance of religious groups, largely coming from evangelical churches, which is working under the banner of the Micah Challenge to try to advance the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals. So I will stop there. Every one of those issues has a religious dimension and a secular dimension. Each one of them has the potential to make a big difference, and each of them requires both dialogue, partnership, and cooperation. Thank you.